What's going on, everybody? Gareth here, FCP Euro. Welcome back to the DIY video. Today we're going to be replacing the transfer case fluid on a 2013 328i xDrive that you can see behind us. So this is a later model F30 chassis, as you can see, and unfortunately BMW has gone away with a drain plug on this transfer case, so you're going to be forced to siphon as much fluid as possible out of the fill plug. Basically, at least on this F30, everything is relatively straightforward. The mounting bolt for it, for the main bushing, is not going to be too difficult to get to, but you do have to lower down the cross brace, you do have to remove some splash shields, so it is somewhat involved, but it's really not too bad. We're going to talk about some of the specifics once we get into the job, but now that we talked about that, let's talk about some of the tools you're going to need to do this job successfully, and we'll go from there. You're going to need an 8mm and 10mm socket for removing the splash shield, and then from that point, you're going to want a variety of ratchets, a torque wrench that can do at least 70 Nm of torque. You'll also want a 17mm Allen for removing the fill plug. I have this 3/8 to 1/2 inch adapter just because this is a 1/2 inch socket, 16mm, an 18mm, a 13mm, a 10mm, which is for one little nut that holds on splash shield, and then an E12 torque socket. And then of course you're going to want your transfer pump in order to pull fluid out of the transfer case as much as you can, and as well as putting the new fluid back in. So really not that many tools required. So now that we've talked about the tools we're going to need to do this job, let's go and get right into it. So the transfer case on the F30s only has a fill plug, and kind of like every transfer case on most BMWs, the fill and drain plug are completely blocked by the transfer case mount bracket. In our case, our fill plug is basically right up in there, so we got to remove this entire bracket. Before I start removing anything, I want to support the weight of the transfer case with this pole jack. If you were working in a driveway, just use a jack for that. And the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to remove the main mount bolt, which goes through the transfer case mount. It's a 16 and an 18. 18mm nut, 16mm bolt. And putting some weight on the transfer case kind of helps aid us in removal of this bolt. From here we have a series of 13mm bolts we need to remove. And then we have a bunch of shorter E10 bolts over here that we have to remove. We have an E10 bolt over here, actually two of them for the exhaust hanger. And then we have the exhaust shield here, which is just held on by these two 8mm. And then on this exhaust shield, we can somewhat bend it slightly to kind of get it out of the way. Now we're just going to take a 14mm Allen. We're going to break this free. So the key here is we need to siphon as much of the fluid out of the transfer case fill plug as you can. Unfortunately, the design of this ATC 35 transfer case actuator, which actually appears to be leaking pretty good, we're gonna have to take a look at that later, is in the way. There's a whole bunch of obstruction in the way of the fill plug. So the reality of this is you might be able to get 40% of the fluid out, but that's, you know, we're talking absolute best case scenario here. Even if you're only able to remove some fluid, and you're just basically doing a little bit of a basic drain and fill, that's better than absolutely nothing, because when we look at the color of this fluid coming out, it's pretty dark. So even if it's just a matter of replacing some of the fluid with new fluid, that's better than nothing. And you know, these transfer cases in general don't really hold that much fluid as it is, so I think we've done as much as we can. I would say we removed probably 300 to 400 milliliters. I want to say the capacity on this is 700 milliliters. So, you know, the only other way to really drain one of these things out is to remove the transfer case entirely, flip it upside down, which is not realistic. I'm gonna go ahead and use the BMW Group DTF1, TF0870, I think is the shell spec for this. It is the only fluid that can go in these transfer cases. That's all she's gonna take. Went ahead and put on a new fill plug. Go ahead and tighten that up with a ratchet here. Torque spec is gonna be 60 Newton meters. There we go. And now at this point, we just need to go ahead and take a little bit of brake parts cleaner here, spray down the excess that poured out. You know, at most, I'd say we'd probably put 400 milliliters in total, which isn't great, but it's better than nothing. Because, like I said, you saw that fluid that came out, it's pretty dark. And the color of the fluid is not an indicator of how bad it is. It's just very oxidized at that point. And with these transfer cases, they're pretty sensitive. So anything we do to prolong the service life, it's worth doing, even if you can't exchange all the fluid. The first thing I'm going to do is get the big mounting bolt lined up with the main transfer case mount. So first thing, I put the bolt back in. That kind of helps line up everything. Go ahead and loosely put the nut back on. Gonna reinstall our 13 millimeter bolts. Just gonna thread everything in by hand for now. Just want to get it all started and lined up. Worst thing you can do is tighten down a single bolt, and not be able to line anything else up afterwards. All of the main mounting bolts for the transfer case mount bracket, they have washers on them. Only the exhaust bracket e-Torx bolts do not have washers, so just be aware of that. And then torque spec on the main mounting bolt here for that rubber bushing, 68 Newton meters. And then the last thing we need to do, straighten out this exhaust shield and then reinstall our 8 millimeter screws. We reinstall our splash shields now, 8 millimeter fasteners, with the exception of one in the rear that's a 10. So as you can see, the service is actually really simple. While it might seem intimidating with some basic hand tools, you can definitely go ahead and take this job on yourself. And while BMW does not have service ratings for things like differential and transfer cases and all these other things, we do recommend doing these services on your own car to extend the service life of these components, because differentials and transfer cases and all these things cost a lot of money. And even though BMW's made it a little bit more difficult for you to do it, you could still do it even with those basic hand tools that we show you in this video. So we hope you learned something. If you have any questions or comments, leave in the comment box below. We'll definitely get back to you with any question that you have. Hit that like button. Also subscribe. We have a lot more videos on the way. And as always, we'll see you for the next one. Thank you for the support.